Welcome back to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and that new intro, of course, and that new thumbnail attached to the podcast is because we are running a summer series of the podcast focused entirely on Korean literature. And that is also why I'm so happy to have today's guest on the podcast, Jerome de Wit. Jerome is a junior professor at the University of Tübingen in the Department of Korean Studies. But importantly for today's podcast, he did his PhD dissertation on a very unique time inside Korean literature. This is the war period, 1950 to 1953. And not only is this a focus on the literature and the writers, but it's also a conscious attempt to capture the literature from both sides. This is North Korean and South Korean writers. How they saw the war, how they portrayed it in their literature, and just what messages they were trying to get across to their own populations. Throughout this, we're going to look at the formation of ideology, how it built up, and the similarities and the differences on either side of the battle lines. Fundamental concepts like total war, which meant all of society was suddenly brought into the war effort, and propaganda was there not just to cheer on the forces, but to keep morale up and explain away suffering in a way that made both sides engaged fundamentally in not just the conflict, but striving towards an overall victory. This is an inside look at the motivations for why the writers were doing what they were doing. How this literature tried to rouse the readers on either side, how it tried to manipulate feeling and emotion, their depiction of nationalism and the Minjok, and from that, key dilemmas that emerged at the time, and difficult tightrope acts, where both sides were very conscious to paint the other as the enemy, while also painting the common people on the other side as part of them, as part of their nation, their race, with the enemy being the foreign powers, the elites, the politicians, and the military generals. And of course, this bleeds into all the descriptions of the enemy and how this propaganda was built up in ever more emotional tones. And there is also the construction of womanhood. And again, the difficult lines that writers tried to walk here. On one side, looking for total mobilization and women fighting the battles, even if far from the front lines. While at the other side, looking for a very conventional, traditional form of womanhood as mothers of the nation and all the gendered constructs that build up around that. But most fascinating here is the look and that dichotomy between each side. By focusing on the writers and the narratives, we not only begin to see how Koreans began to construct the other of their Korean brothers and sisters on the other side of the battle lines, but also how much of this ideology has sustained today and lingered over time. This is testament to just how successful it was and how deeply psychological the whole process became. And while of course I'm going to link Jerome's PhD dissertation below, entitled Writing Under Wartime Conditions, North and South Korean Writers During the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, I'm also going to provide a link to his forthcoming book on the same topic, Literature and Cultural Identity During the Korean War, Comparing North and South Korean Writing, due to be published soon. And from here out, I'll let Jerome play the story out for you, in all the detail, the twists, the evolution on the ground, and of course the unique literature that came about from this time, and those people that produced it. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We've made a conscious decision here on the Korea Now podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do like the podcast and you do want it to continue, please consider supporting us directly at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media, and all the help in that regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through North and South Korean literature during the Korean War, this is Jerome de Wit. Jerome de Wit, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Hello, Jed. Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm really glad to have you on the podcast. I was really hoping to get you on the podcast during this literature series because I'd been bumping into your articles throughout the years, and I focused a lot on North and South Korea, but I always found them so interesting. And what you've done with your dissertation and articles as well is focus on writing during the Korean War, but also writing from both sides of it, North and South Korean perspective. So as a first question, I might ask you why you found this so interesting and why you chose it as a topic for your PhD dissertation.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, and it kind of ties into my personal interests. So when I was around 15, I was very fascinated to read wartime stories and how soldiers experienced the war, and especially the question that always came to my mind was how do soldiers deal with ever impending death? It always looms over their head, and how do they cope with this? And my grandfather used to always tell stories about his experiences during the Second World War. So that's why it came naturally to me to read more about this topic. And then one day, I, of course, saw the television series MASH on television. And I was like, the Korean War? When was that? Is this the 1960s or something? I didn't know anything about Korea or Asia at that time. So I went to my local library found one book that was written about the Korean War. And then after having read it, I was deeply disappointed because it was only about the Soviet Union and the US and the Cold War. And they do mention in a kind of footnote that 1 million Koreans died, but that's where it ends. So I was like, okay, it's the Korean War. So many Korean people died. So how did they experience the war? So that's why this was the reason why I started with Korean studies. And I thought this would be an interesting topic for a PhD. And especially I thought focusing on the writers from both North and South Korea, I may be able to answer my question of how the Korean people experienced the war.
So let's jump straight into the dissertation then, and we can build this up like a story. It's really interesting. I might start where your first chapter starts, and that is the emergence and institutionalization of ideology during the war. So this is those early stages. And of course, the Korean War starts on June 25th, 1950. And you write, interestingly here, that the literary fields of North and South Korea had to adapt very quickly to the situation. And that's not something that we often think about, the idea of literature and writers having to adapt to the situation. But so I might get to take us there into this need for sudden adaptation and change, but also this topic which you introduce here, which runs throughout a lot of your dissertation, and very importantly so, is the concept of total war and how this comes from the colonial period and why it's so important.
Yes, so, and that is quite interesting. Like in other wars and in other countries, you indeed see that when a war breaks out, that writers have to adapt, or even they have to be forced by by their government to start writing in favor of their government and the war. However, in the case of the North and South Korean writers, there's not really an adaptation period that you see there. I mean, the war breaks out. Of course, it comes sudden to all the intellectuals, either in the North or the South, because otherwise it's not a surprise attack, of course. However, within 24 hours, they already gather themselves for a meeting, and they immediately set out, okay, war broke out. This is what we have to do. We have to set up wartime writer organizations. We have to write propaganda posters. Somebody has to follow the army to keep reporting to the people what is going on. So actually, they immediately knew what was asked of them without the government telling them what to do. So that was quite surprising to me. So, of course, naturally, I had to find the answer to this question then, like where did they, like why do they not have this adaptation period? How come they already are very familiar with a war? And then, of course, naturally, you go to the colonial period, the end of the colonial period, when most of these writers were very active to support the Japanese, of course. And most of the ideas that they forged then, so from 1948 to 1945, you see that reappearing during the Korean wartime. So it's very interesting. The Americans, of course, always wanted to call it a limited war, but in the minds of the writers, they really saw a task for themselves as, no, this is a total war, and in a total war, writers are very important because we have to keep the ideology high, and then we have to keep the population keeping them supporting the war, and that is the task of us.
And also interesting, you write, of course, this total war narrative is used for their ideological and propaganda purposes, of course. But you also write, and this is interesting, that they also use this principle in this narrative to attain, and I quote here, cultural power and to strengthen their own status within society. So, what do you mean by that?
Well, the authors, especially writers, they really managed to get a very high position. They were very close with the politicians at that time, and thanks to this, they really managed to completely dominate what kind of cultural activities would be done. They would be the ones who would get all the money. And other artists, they would be kind of left out. And in the South Korean case, that's quite interesting to see, actually, because when it is almost time to sign the Armistice Agreement in 1953, then you see that, for example, the publishing houses are starting to kind of rebel against these writers and start to accuse them of completely hoarding all the resources and not giving the opportunity for others to voice something. So there's also like a university professor who starts to complain in one of the essays that I found. So that is what I meant. They really managed to completely dominate the cultural sphere at that time. However, in the case of South Korea, this kind of hurt them, because after 1953, you see that writers would never have such a high esteem in South Korean society anymore as they used to.
And so let's move into the question of the motivation for writing during the Korean War. And this is interesting because, as you write, in the early stages of this war, a lot of these writers, unless they fled all the way south to Busan, would have experienced both South Korean and North Korean rule within a very short period of time. So I might get a comment on that as an interesting place that these writers found themselves, but also what happened once those lines began to stabilize in 1951. And these writers, as you put here, they all began to join these different groups under different authorities and different army groups, such as the Blue Sky Group and Army Writers Group, the Navy Writers Group. All these organizations begin to emerge. So why were these organizations so important? And that period where these writers found themselves in flux between the North and South Korean troops, why was that so important?
Yes. So you, of course, find a lot of memoirs that are being written after the war, and then most of them, they say, well, we always were in favor of South Korea, or we always were in favor of North Korea. And this is a very easy answer, of course, right? But it completely neglects the social circumstances in which these writers found themselves. And that is why what you see, especially at the beginning of the war, when the front line is oscillating back and forth, you really see that these writers are in imminent danger. And indeed, like you said, only the writers who managed to flee to Busan, they were kind of off the hook in South Korea. But then when Seoul was recaptured, it was those writers who did not manage to escape, who were starting to be accused of having collaborated with North Korea. And then they would immediately also create a link with, if you have been collaborating with North Korea, you must also have been collaborating with the Japanese in the colonial period. So there's also this kind of this kind of colonial legacy that has not been dealt with yet, that also makes an appearance there. And therefore, it's interesting to see that when writers chose to join one of these wartime writing organizations in April 1951, you do see that they don't really do that out of a genuine patriotism or genuine support for their own government, but it's really to stay alive, right? They really have to show to the new government, to their state, that they are still loyal and that they can still be trusted. So that is why they start writing propaganda for either South Korea or North Korea. And this is especially interesting to see that those who were actually had very leftist tendencies in the 1945-1946 period, they start to become really, or at least on the surface, they start to show that, no, we always hated communism and we will not be fooled by it again. So that is very interesting to see.
On that point about this need to show loyalty, this is interesting organization that joins. It's the National Rehabilitation and Guidance League. And reading through your work here, this is organization that encourages writers to, with leftist leaning sympathies, to come forward and self-report themselves. And this seems to be a significant phenomena after the especially after the South Korean and UN forces retake at least the southern half of the peninsula. There's this real focus on not just catching and reporting and punishing leftist leaning writers, but also this constant act of rehabilitation and ownership, and this idea that you've done something wrong, but you can reaffirm yourself in the light of the nation. This becomes an interesting theme that I found in your work here.
Yes, that is indeed interesting to see that, like, for example, Chung Ji-young is one of the victims of this, right? I wrote about him, how he managed to join the National Guidance and Rehabilitation League. And that was actually out of a fluke, because his neighbors had accused him of going back and forth to North Korea, crossing the 30th parallel and then coming back again. And he said, well, those are just rumors. That is not true. However, then he goes to the police to ask for protection. And then the police tells him, well, you can get protection if you join this this organization. And that actually causes his death then, because when the war breaks out, he is never heard of anymore. So it's very likely that he was one of the victims of the National Guidance League massacres that took place. Yes.
So how common were executions? I mean, this it may sound, looking back on the period, like this was, a kind of trivial thing, whether some writer writes about the leftist leaning, the communist ideas, or whether they're a rightist and they're more conservative. It seems trivial looking back, but as you write there seems to be an awful lot of execution. And of course, you write about one writer, I forget the name, escapes me right now, but I think it was a woman, and she is punished for her rightist, sorry, her leftist association, and she finds herself with a 25-year prison sentence, and quite happy and quite lucky she finds herself that she wasn't executed.
Yes, exactly. So you're mentioning No Chon-myung, indeed, also a very famous female poet at that time. And yes, she was indeed one of the victims. And there you can see that since she didn't really have good connections, so that was also very important. If you were part of the right group, the correct writers group, you were often off the hook of being punished. But she unfortunately did not have such a big status in the literary field at that time. So indeed, she was singled out for punishment, and indeed even managed to escape execution barely. And happily, thanks to some friends that did plea for her cause, she was already released after 10 months in prison. So she indeed was very lucky. But indeed, it happened on both sides. So this is a South Korean case, like a South Korean court that would judge these writers for wrongdoings. In North Korea, it also happened. So you had these people courts that were set up, and one of the victims there is Kim Pal-bong. He's also very famous during the colonial period. And he always writes about, I used to be a Japanese collaborator. So after 1945, he did not write anything anymore. He didn't feel that he was allowed to have a voice in what the new Korea would look like. However, then he is judged by a people's court at the beginning of the war. They beat him to death. At least the mob thinks that they killed him. However, he survived miraculously. And of course, that fuels his anti-communist beliefs then ever after. So it is quite common at the beginning of the war to see such things happening. And punishments, and especially if you were already a public intellectual, both governments actively sought out these people for punishment.
I'm wondering how many of these writers, I mean, of course, we only have access to a few, but how many of these writers, in your opinion, were left-leaning as opposed to right-leaning? I know it's hard to look back on, but it would seem, looking back on the period, that a lot of these people may not have had much choice about who they joined. Suddenly you are living in a country under control from the South Korean government and Sungmin Rhee government, which is fervently anti-communist. And then all of a sudden you have Kim Il-sung's North Korea ruling you. So it seems like a lot of these people would simply be changing sides to survive in this period. So do we get a feel on how many of them really were sympathizers with communism? And I suppose at this point we should bring in some of them, because a few of them went north after the war when they had a chance. People like Han Sora and Lee Tae-jun went north, of course.
Yes, they already went north before the war started, indeed. But it's also interesting to see those who were the most fervent anti-communists, they actually also started their careers as leftist writers, even as far back, or no, not even as far back, but even as recent as 1946, 1947. For example, Park Hyung-jun is such a person. He also shows that he's writing for leftist magazines in South Korea in 1946, 1947. However, during the Korean War, you will not notice this at all. He's very anti-communist in his opinions then. And Kim Pal-bong is the same, like I also already mentioned him. He also actually started his career at the KAP, so this proletarian writers organization, during the colonial periods, and then he changed in the 1930s. And they're not the only ones. You can actually see that predominantly the intellectuals at that time indeed were leaning to the left. So that is why it's always still the question, like, why did Lee Tae-jun change his allegiance? He didn't seem to have any leftist leanings before 1945. However, it was an overall trend among intellectuals to see more interest, to have more interest in communism and socialism and what it could bring to society.
How successful were the efforts of these writers to, I suppose, absolve themselves of their ideological failings in the past? I mean, I'm putting air quotes around that, of course. But this idea, you have these writers that were once left-leaning, changing their right, and now they're fervently right-leaning, cause a lot of pressure behind it. But I wonder how the stain stuck or didn't stick, because of course, as you mentioned, the idea of Japanese collaboration, and that's one of those stains that seem to have lingered within Korean society. So I wonder whether the idea that you were once a leftist leaning writer was this the kind of stain that writers managed to get rid of during and even after the war, or was it something that lingered with them, like the idea of being previously a Japanese collaborator?
Not so much, indeed. So indeed, you have this idea that you can rehabilitate yourself. So if you just continuously show that you are in support of South Korea and the South Korean state, then you're really off the hook, and you don't get into much trouble anymore, and nobody will really bring it up. And it's indeed mostly this unresolved issue of Japanese collaboration that really lingers, but having been a communist or socialist leaning, that part is indeed interestingly kind of missing from the whole debates that you see between writers when they start accusing each other.
So beyond the accusations and the ideology here, I have to assume that one of the great motivations for writing in this period, of course, following government lines, of course, was to support the war effort.
Well, you mean for the writers?
I mean the content of the literature itself. I'm assuming that what they were trying to achieve in a lot of this, apart from just the ideological battleground, was also a sort of galvanization around the forces and the idea that we're a country at war.
And that is where it's interesting. So when you look at the propaganda that was written, you see that there is a difference in the propaganda of North and South Korea. So in North Korea, they indeed will focus mostly on trying to keep the people's motivation to keep fighting and to support the troops. That is really the most dominant propaganda that you will find in North Korea. In South Korea, they, of course, also would like to do that, but you will not find that many stories that are focusing on the heroics of soldiers. It's mostly about ideology, and there are many characters at the home front that you find in South Korean wartime literature, and whether their ideology is pure or not, whether they truly are anti-communists, whether they're truly loyal to the South Korean state, that is something that really marks the wartime literature of South Korea at that time.
So let's look into those novels themselves and some of that content, because I have to assume that there was a large degree of direction from the governments involved in what these writers should be writing about. And that begs the question of what kind of novels they were producing, because once you have a directive on what you must write, it becomes harder to be creative, of course. So I wonder what these novels look like, whether they were flowing stories that people enjoyed, or were they stodgy academic, I suppose academics are the wrong word, but kind of stodgy works that you can see what the government is trying to tell you, or were they kind of much more subtle messages filtered through the novels and the writing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is where it's interesting. There's not that much coming from the government, either in North or South Korea. So it's really the writers themselves who already know what they have to write and how they have to write their literature during wartime. So it's not that the government tells them, okay, this is the message you have to tell the people, and you start writing. No, they really do this out of their own volition, and they already have their own idea of how they should approach the public, the reading public. And that is why it's interesting to see that in North Korea, for example, of course, you have this speech in April 1951 of Kim Il-sung. However, what the writers do with this, because, of course, when Kim Il-sung gives his directive to writers of, well, this is the kind of literature you have to write about, it is very general. They're just general remarks of what they have to do. And what you see is that the North Korean writers, they say, well, thank you, Kim Il-sung. This is indeed very nice of you. However, they just go their own way. And the government is not as much involved in 1951. You really see that this starts again from 1953. Then the North Korean government starts to try to push the writers to change their tack and to write in a more different direction. But before that, the Communist Party, for example, is hardly ever mentioned in North Korean propaganda stories. It is not the reason why these characters in the stories are deciding to pick up a weapon and run to the front. It is mostly the experience of war and the bombardments, and then seeing the Americans as an enemy that fuels their desire to help out and to actively fight in the war. What's interesting about the quality of the stories is the South Korean stories, they are not really of a very high quality. They are indeed your very average, straightforward stories where you have a hero and the depictions of the enemy are very black and white. And the hero is never really in danger. So I imagine that a reader of the South Korean wartime stories, they were not that entertained by them. This is different with the North Korean stories. What is interesting is that, of course, you have the enemy, the American enemy, and they have to be defeated. But when you have descriptions of the front and when the North Koreans are fighting with the American enemy, they do not diminish the enemy in any way. They really see the American and the UN army as a formidable force. They are superior with their equipment. So the only thing that we have going for us is our ideology and our will to fight for our country. And that's why when you turn the page, you never know whether your hero of the story is going to die or whether the person survives. So the stories are much more interesting to read there. Whereas when there is like a war description in South Korean stories, when they fight against the Chinese enemy, for example, the Chinese are just depicted as very stupid. They don't really have a strategy, but to throw people to the front, and they are all massacred by the heroic South Korean soldiers. Then, of course, this begs the question, if you're a wartime reader, if it is so easy to defeat the Chinese army, then why are we not winning the war? Right? So it's interesting to see a qualitative difference there.
That's a really interesting thought, that one, that you can't be too positive about a war because, of course, the people around you are experiencing it and they know how hard it is and what they're going through. And if you put a too positive a light on it, they're not going to enjoy the story. And, of course, also that idea that they know where it's going. But I wonder how that might relate to other literature around the world, other wartime literature. Do you see that same idea? I mean, I don't have a firm grasp on wartime literature outside of the Korean War. So I wonder whether that same kind of ideology and propaganda plays out through them, or are we seeing a change here in what the Korean literature looked like compared to other literature from other countries?
Well, I did find a similarity there. So I just mentioned indeed that the Communist Party is not really mentioned in North Korean wartime stories. And you also find this at the beginning of the Second World War in the Soviet Union. So when the Germans were approaching Moscow, you do not find stories that are cheating the reader into believing that the Soviet Union will win this war and it will be very easy to defeat the enemy, and that the Communist Party is all to thank for this. These kind of stories would be very they would not really help the cause, of course, of the Communist Party. And that is why it's interesting to see that Catherine Hodgson, she wrote about the Second World War and the Soviet Union wartime stories, and she showing that the Communist Party will be victorious would not help in any way. So the wartime effort and to try to motivate the people to keep fighting for the Soviet Union, that it would require some other impetus. And that is what you see in North Korea there as well, right? I mean, you had at the beginning of the Korean War, of course, the propaganda that the North Korean state would be victorious very soon. You had all these posters of we will be in Busan in a few weeks. And then all of a sudden, 1 month later, there are UN troops as far north as the North Korean-China border. So this is not really helping the legitimacy of the North Korean Communist Party, of course. So, and that's where you therefore see that most of the stories that are written during the wartime in North Korea, that the Communist Party or Kim Il-sung is hardly ever mentioned. It's really the will of the people and their their wish to see to see a liberated Korea and to not see the North Korean state to disappear. That is really a driving force for the characters to keep helping in the war.
So let's speak about something that is mentioned throughout his literature and mentioned an awful lot, and that is the Minjok, which translates loosely to Korean race or ethno-racial state, but it is a Korean word that is designed to define the Korean people as a national ethnic identity. And this is such an important term that emerges. It seems to emerge through all this writing. It seems to really pulse just behind the surface of so much of this. And I'm going to get you to explain, I suppose, what it is and where it came from. But I'm going to quote you here because this is really interesting. This is an interesting way to look at Minjok. You write, since the exact meaning of Minjok is never defined, the term becomes an empty signifier, though also a very powerful one. So what do you mean by that? Because that's an interesting way to open up this term of Minjok and its place within within the literature of this period.
Yes. Yeah, so of course, I'm not going, like I say, it cannot really be defined. It's really always in relation to something. It kind of conjures up an image in the minds of people, and that is the power of it, right? And that is very closely related to all nationalisms. If you just say, well, the German nationalism, or I'm from the Netherlands, like Dutch nationalism, it conjures up some image. It doesn't matter what, like can be that you associate it more with the language or with certain, like maybe with football. It can be anything, and that is kind of a powerful tool then in your arsenal to try to motivate people to fight for such a concept. And that is what you see in the South Korean wartime literature a lot, that they say, well, we are the true legitimate bearers of the Minjok legitimacy, and that is why you should follow the South Korean state. And if you follow the North Korean ways and socialism, this is a dead end. This is not where we are headed as a people in the future. So, and that is what they then start to use often in their literature, that they keep trying to convince the people of this idea that no, the South Korean state is really the true legitimate heir of the Minjok and its history.
I'm also getting you to open up another interesting part that runs through all of this as well, and that is on the topic of Minjok, is this constant repeating theme of each side being accused, and of course foreign powers like America and the Soviet Union, for example, but everyone seemed to have been accused of dividing the Minjok. So why does this run so firmly, and why does it repeat so often in the literature, this idea of not just who is in the Minjok and who is not, but the idea of breaking it open and separating it and dividing it against itself?
Yes, so this is, this indeed ties into this more racial explanation indeed of the nation and its people, where you have like this idea that is still very strong at that time of a pure-blooded Koreanness, and that is has not been impure for centuries, but now because of the circumstances, it is in danger of becoming impure, and that is mostly explained in the wartime literature when you look at the description of prostitutes, Korean women prostituting themselves for American soldiers. And when children are born out of these relationships, how do we see these children then? Are they still part of the Minjok? That is becoming a very important question in the minds of several South Korean intellectuals at that time. Yes, that's where you can see that, therefore, they are, of course, grateful that America is helping, but on the other hand, they are defiling the Minjok in this way as well.
So, close on the same theme a little bit, let's move into another chapter of your dissertation. This was about representation of the enemy from both sides. And you write that, of course, one of the methods used is to enhance morale on one side, is to make a clear distinction between the good and the evil characters. And that is to talk about the other side almost lacking human traits, this idea of dehumanization, that they're predatory or they're barbaric. But this also creates a big problem within the literature, because as you just mentioned, this idea of Minjok, both sides are talking about this divided Minjok, and they want to reunify the Minjok. And if you spend your time speaking about the other side as inhuman, this could be a problem when you want to then bring them back in one day and reunify with these people. And the strategy that they seem to use is to focus their attention on the elites, the political leaders, the army officers, and not the common man on the ground fighting.
Yes, exactly. And that is the big contradiction that you see throughout the wartime literature. How do we depict the North Korean enemy? I mean, for the Chinese and the American enemy, it is very easy. It's very straightforward. They are, of course, not part of the Minjok, so you can just be done with a description of bestiality and irrationality in their behaviors. However, when it indeed comes to the North Korean enemy or the South Korean enemy, it becomes much more complicated. Indeed, like you say, what happens after we unify isn't like, can we still allow these people to live in a unified Korea in our society? How do we deal with this? Are they able to be rehabilitated, or are there several degrees that we have to use to kind of stratify these believers in like socialism, or the South Koreans who have been collaborating with the Americans? Do they still have a place in a unified Korea? And that is very interesting. So they do try to make this distinction, indeed, like you say, that they put all the blame mostly on the army officers and the political elite, and saying, well, the common people they are just forced to fight for either the South or the North, but actually they inside of them, they actually support us. However, when you look at the stories, this contradiction is sometimes not really resolved, because when it comes to the killing of like friendly troops or friendly people that should be included, so the heroes or friendly people in your society, then it is not the army officers who are doing this. It's mostly the common North Korean soldier or the common South Korean soldier. So therefore then does not help with getting rid of this contradiction at all, and keeps begging the question whether it is indeed possible in a civil war to depict the enemy in such a way as they did.
So let's pull this open from both sides. Let's do the South Korean side first, and how the South Koreans began to represent the enemy on their side. And in your writing here, this is an important moment before the war opens. This is 1948 in October, and this is the Yushu Rebellion. And very interestingly, from these very early moments, you write that the Minister of Education asked the National Association of Cultural Organizations to form writer investigation parties. And these people toured these regions for 6 days and then published within newspapers. And what they were trying to do is they had this idea in their mind that ideological education was a cure of sorts for these uprisings. So I might open up that period there, because this seems to run throughout the war period itself, this idea of ideological education coming from the South about the nature and the evils of communism.
Yes, exactly. And that is why I went back to the Yeosu Rebellion and in 1948, because the whole narrative that is created about the enemy, either in the North or in the South, it really already is created in 1948, and people still think that sometimes these images, they were created during the Korean War time, but actually it's already indeed in 1948 when both the South and North Korean state are set up, that they start really focusing on this ideological enemy in the other part of the Korean Peninsula. And indeed for the South, this is indeed an important moment in time with the Yosu rebellion, where they indeed start to want to answer the question whether the enemy in the north, or these ideological enemies, whether they are still part of the Minjok or not, how we depict them, how do we tell the people in our society that these are evil and that you should not join them, and that is interesting because, like I said, the writers, they had a very significant influence at that time to influence public opinion, and therefore it is their descriptions of the North Korean enemy that really lasts and also gets kind of imprinted in the heads of the South Korean people.
So I want to bring in one of the stories at the moment, because this, for me, I found this story really interesting as a literary device, and this is a story from 1952 called A Dark Night by Park Yong-jun, and this is used, I suppose, to further that narrative that we just mentioned there. And I'll get you to introduce the story and all, but it is this idea of two brothers, and one is a captured North Korean prisoner of war. And of course, the South Korean brother approaches his captive brother and wants him released because he's expecting him to be a part of the Minjok, and of course and his brother still. And then you have this moment where he sees in his eyes that his eyes have changed, and he is in fact a poisonous snake. And then at the end, he, with only brief hesitation, ends up shooting his own brother.
Yes, exactly, and he's continuously indeed questioning himself, of course, like, I want to see my brother as still being part of the Minjok because we grew up together, we have this blood bond together, doesn't that count for anything? And then his superior has to keep telling him it doesn't mean anything, and that indeed eventually guides him into making the correct decision of shooting his own brother indeed. This story is very it's a good example of the kind of stories you find, and it's interesting to see. So there are many stories that are about North Korean prisoners, and they are being escorted by South Korean soldier, and then they start to have a conversation with each other about like, are you really a communist? Why did you join communism? And in some cases, you have indeed this narrative that I was forced to become a communist. But in other of these type of stories, you find that that they are indeed genuinely believers of the socialist cause, and they cannot be helped. And it is sometimes also because of the good nature of the South Korean soldier that they even end up being killed. There's one story by Kim Par-bong about that, where a South Korean soldier escorts a North Korean prisoner and then thinks, I knew him before the Korean War started, so he was always a very nice person. However, eventually this North Korean ends up shooting the South Korean soldier, and that, of course, then should show the reader that you should never trust a communist. And it's very interesting that there's one person throughout, like in the Korean War, that tries to go against this, and that is Hwang Sun-won, because he also has a very famous story, of course, Hak Cranes, where there is this same kind of topic of a South Korean soldier escorting a North Korean prisoner. However, Hwang Sun-won approaches it completely different. He kind of puts things on its head and actually shows throughout the story in a very subtle way that this depiction of the enemy is all in the head of the South Korean character. But what the North Korean character is truly thinking and the fear that he's feeling, we only see that at the very end of the story of Cranes, and that is very interesting. So you really see that there's only one writer that I found in the Korean War that tried to go against this very dominant narrative that is being created about the enemy, this ideological enemy.
That is an interesting thought there, and of course it pings in my ear another story again by Park Young-jun called The Partisan. This is 1952, and it seems to me, I'm not sure what your take is, but of course it seems to me that what he's trying to do, in at least in part of the story, is he has a narrator, and this narrator at one point talks about his own experiences inside North Korea, inside a communist society, and he speaks about the wealth class and the high-ranking members who rule over and oppress the people below them. And it seems to be that this is a very conscious ideological effort and almost a fear of the attraction of communism, that they have to say, we have seen it, we have experienced it, it's not what they're promising you.
Yes, and that's very interesting. So it also showcases Park Young-jun's flirtation with socialism, right? I mentioned before that he's one of the writers who had these leftist leanings, even in 1946. And actually, this story is also very interesting because it is based off a story that he already wrote as a pro-Japanese story in 1942. At the time, it had the title Yoin e Milim, so the jungle woman. Maybe you can translate it as this, where it is indeed also the case where you have like this person who used to be a partisan coming down the hill and has to be re-educated and see that the socialist cause is not really the way to go. And this story is very interesting. It has really many facets to it, and for me, it's interesting to really see Park Young-jun's way of thinking. Actually, he's using his own experience with his flirtation of socialism and how he tried to get rid of it, or did he really get rid of it? We don't, of course, know. But it's interesting to see that in this story, Parchisan, it's the partisan.
So lingering on that idea of South Korean representations of the enemy, of course, it wasn't just North Koreans, it was Chinese. And through your research here, interesting, the Chinese have a different, they're played out very differently from what the North Koreans are played out. They're played out as much more animalistic, I suppose, if I can call it that. This idea that they can't be controlled and they're less than human. And this is something that the North Koreans almost play against the Americans as well from their side, which we will get to. But this idea that the South Koreans, the Chinese, when they come down to fight the war, they can't contain themselves and they spend most of their time trying to rape South Korean women. And of course, this, as you write, is not just designed to provoke hatred and fear, which of course it is, but again, it's that idea of Korean purity and the risk of these foreigners, that what they present to it.
Yes, exactly. And that is, so it is not really indeed this fear of like what they want to indeed show here, because of course most of the writers were male, is not that the rape itself is a problem of our women, but it's really the more how do you say, this imaginary idea that in this way our bloodline becomes impure, and they are indeed trying to eradicate the Minjok in this way, and that counts even for worse than the actual physical rape, it seems, when you read these stories. And that is a very straightforward way to depict the Chinese enemy, indeed, that even when bombs are flying around their ears and they're about to get killed, they are still only thinking about, if I see a Korean woman, I have to rape this woman. It is this kind of idea that these South Korean writers want to portray of the Chinese enemy, and there's indeed nothing else to it. They don't have any other agency but their animalistic natures, indeed.
And another common representation of this literature seems to be that of the internal enemy, those South Koreans who are betraying the Minjok from within. There's this famous incident that I hadn't heard of till I read through your work, the Territorial Army incident, which is this moment where a huge amount of funds and resources are misappropriated by certain South Koreans, and it's a theme that seems to run that the higher ups within society, and there are people in there that are trying to enrich themselves at the expense of South Korea and of the Minjok, and it almost has an echo of the Japanese colonial period, where people would once again betray their Minjok to, I suppose, get rich under Japanese rule.
Yes, exactly. It has because that is indeed how the Japanese also wanted to show the Korean people how they should keep supporting the Japanese war effort, and that was to live a frugal life, indeed. And that is again taken up by the South Korean writers during the Korean War. However, then it being a civil war and not the Pan-Asian War of the late 1930s, early 1940s, they indeed put a different spin to it, and indeed say that these people who try to enrich themselves, who only are egoistically thinking about advantages for themselves, they are not part of the Minjok. And this creates a very interesting dynamic in the wartime stories, that eventually, when it is time to, when the armistice is about to be signed, that hardly anybody in the minds of these writers can be part of the Minjok anymore, because the general population is indeed tired of the war. They want to see it end. And then the politicians, they also kind of have made peace with the idea that the war is not going to be won. We are stuck here at the 38th parallel, so we have to sign the armistice. And then you see that the stories, they really start to focus on soldiers that are very deeply disappointed with the South Korean population. They don't feel the support anymore. However, there's only one group in South Korean society that's still helping the soldiers, and those are the writers. So it is kind of at the end very self-aggrandizing the writers and what they have been trying to do. And it's kind of like appropriating this whole idea of only we are actually still the true Minjok, and that is why this idea of the Minjok is very interesting, because it can be used to include and exclude, but then eventually it kind of seems that they are excluding everybody except themselves as a writer and those soldiers who are fighting at the front.
Let's move to the North Korean representations of the enemy then from their side. And of course, these representations through your work seem to focus on two groups. One is, of course, America, and the other is South Korean politicians. And they get different treatments of kind. And some of the language here we can still see echoing today. And that is, well, let's start with a treatment of Americans first. And this is an idea that that America are not here to fight a war on South Korea's behalf, but America here once again to colonize the world. They're an imperial aggressor. They can't be stopped, and they're an enemy of the Minjok. And this language comes through this writing of wolves, dogs, wild beasts, and jackals, and even, you're right, demonic language, the idea of hungry ghosts and devils. So let's pause there for a minute. I'm going to explain the North Korean representations of America and what they're hoping to achieve with this.
So for them, it's indeed this war against imperialism and these imperialist countries. And now, of course, America being the front runner of imperialism has to be stopped. So they use this idea to try to tell the North Korean population that the Americans have absolutely not the best interests in mind for the Korean people. And there are a few in South Korean society, these politicians who are joining the Americans, who think that they will be well off to help out the Americans, but actually they are completely wrong, because eventually the Americans, they do not care about them at all. And this is often the depiction that in the stories, for example, when the North Korean army attacks, then it is the Americans who are running first, and they just leave the South Koreans behind, and they say, well, you have to defend us and see to it that we are able to retreat safely. So that is then, of course, to show that, they never care about the South Koreans. They just use them for getting out of harm's way themselves. And indeed, the language that they use is very much the same as indeed the Japanese used against the Americans during the Second World War, because of course also in North Korea there were many writers who had experience writing for Japan, at the end of the Second World War. So they have no problem to keep using these same images again. And yeah, that's interesting. And of course, they also use again this idea of the pure bloodline being defiled, and that's why. Again, just like in South Korean stories, it is then, of course, now not the Chinese soldiers who are raping Korean women, but the Americans. And there's indeed, again, this idea that by doing so, our bloodline is becoming defiled, and they try to kill as many Koreans as possible. So they're really out to just massacre all the Koreans if they see a chance to.
So I might bring in a couple of novels here, which I found really interesting on this point. One is Yi Pang-myung's Devils, and this is 1951. And an author that I really enjoyed, actually, Han Sora, 1951, and this is a very famous story called Jackals. And I'll get you to explain those two stories, of course, but both show extremely, not just, I suppose, extremely vicious, extremely nasty, torturous behavior of the Americans, almost sadistic. They really seem to enjoy the violence. And from this writing, what comes across is not just North Koreans' attempts to portray the enemy as dangerous and risky and coming to kill us, but also it almost has a positive vision of the Minjok, as in we are not just distinct from Americans and the rest of the world, but we are morally superior.
Yes, so there is not a kind-hearted American to be found, indeed. They are completely vile, and it indeed seems as if it's indeed this imperialism that kind of fuels this. So here we indeed go again with like the kind of ideology that you adhere to really completely is imprinted on your behavior as a person. And that is what you see play out in these stories. And that's why they want to portray that imperialism breeds this kind of contempt for human life, that they do not value human life at all. And that is very interesting because the other side of the Cold War spectrum, they, of course, also say exactly the same thing, that the communist ideology breeds evil in people. And so they make use of very similar tropes there. Yes, especially the Jackal story is very interesting, I would say, in that respect, especially because as a wartime story, but then having the setting in the colonial period, kind of by doing so, they want to, like Han Sora wants to show that already long before the Korean War started, the Americans already had ambitions on the Korean Peninsula, and especially the ending of the story where she is denied to have her revenge, where she wants to have an eye for an eye. So she demands the killing of Simon, the life of Simon, the boy who beat up her son, who eventually dies. But this is denied for her. And this, of course, if you're reading this story and then the story ends in this way, in this very unsatisfactory way, that provokes quite a bit of anger, I would say, in the reader, that the evil Americans are not being punished for their evil deeds.
So let's move to how the North Koreans depicted the South Koreans then. And you write, this is interesting, that they're either depicted as traitors or victims. And often, of course, victims of the Americans as well. And you write that they are either shown to be servants who simply cater to all the Americans' needs, who do nothing to prevent all these atrocities by the Americans and don't do much about it. So they're lazy, they are lethargic, or they're being taken advantage of. So yeah, here I might get you to open up the idea of how North Koreans were trying to show South Koreans during this period. And again, it seems desperate to also show a distinction between those in power and the common man on the ground.
Yes, exactly. Yes, there we have indeed a comparison between the South Korean wartime literature, indeed. The South Korean people are eagerly awaiting liberation. That is what is shown in these wartime stories. And then indeed, there are some South Koreans who side with the Americans, but only for their own benefit, and they don't care about what happened to fellow Koreans. No, they are just in it for themselves. And then often this is again being related to their previous loyalty to the Japanese. So usually when they're now pro-American, they used to be pro-Japanese. What is interesting though, and of course that also then ties into, are they still part of the Minjok? They don't really, of course, talk about this so openly. However, in the North Korean stories, it is often the case that even when there are these South Koreans who have helped the Americans, even helped in facilitating the killing of fellow Koreans, they can still be rehabilitated in North Korea, in North Korean society. And that is very interesting to see, because in the South Korean stories, this would completely not be possible. They really are very adamant about it. If you have been doing wrong, if you have been loyal to communism, and of course also facilitating the death of fellow South Koreans, then that is it for you. You're not part of the Minjok. You have absolutely no say in this society anymore. And they kind of hint at these people, they just should be excised from society or executed. In North Korean stories, that is not the case. They always leave this possibility open of rehabilitation. So there's indeed one story, for example, that deals with this, where, of course, the North Korean citizens are very angry at these characters of having sided with the Americans. However, they reluctantly, but eventually, they start to accept these people again in North Korean society and make them part of the community again.
So let's touch on the issue of collaboration and how North Korean literature touched on these issues of collaboration. Of course, it has lots of parallels with how the South Koreans did it as well, but I might introduce this through a really interesting novel called Happiness by Wang Kyun. And this is the story of a young lady whose husband is off fighting the war, and suddenly she sees her husband in the hospital where she works, and she's surprised to see him. She asks why he's there, and he's been severely tortured, and he was given a choice by the Americans that you either die or you collaborate. And he says that he collaborated reluctantly with the Americans after torture, but that also he was very conscious to give them trivial or misleading information. And the young lady hears her husband's story, is absolutely furious with him, and now regards him as an enemy. And one of the last things she says is she's furious at her husband's decision to choose his own survival over the greater good of the country. And that, at least from the outside, gives a wonderful insight, I think, to the North Korean ideology and literature at the time.
Yes, exactly. And she indeed also says that you are not my husband anymore, and you have to be tried by a people's court, and they will decide your fate, whether you live or whether you still have something to do for the North Korean state in the future. And then he says, well, I will do that. And towards the end of the novel, he is indeed rehabilitated again. So he makes a reappearance. He's moving towards the front with other North Koreans. And then his wife sees him again, and then he tells her the happy news that the People's Court, of course, have found him guilty, but he can atone for his sins by becoming a partisan in South Korea. And that's why he's very happy to do that. And then he leaves his wife with a very happy feeling, because she kind of trusts the North Korean state. So she indeed didn't want to have anything to do with him anymore. It was over. You're not part of the Minjok. You're not my husband anymore. However, when the North Korean state still says that you can do something useful, or you can atone for your sins, I accept the decision of the North Korean state. So that's very interesting to see that inserted in the story there. Yes.
So let's step into what was the final chapter of your dissertation, and this is the gendered construction of womanhood during the Korean War. And it begins with what I found really, really interesting. This is such a psychological insight, not just into Korea, but into so many minds. And it begins in the middle of winter in 1951, and the novelist Kim Kwang-ju is waiting for a friend at Busan Theatre, and he's watching a young woman wearing makeup and high heels, and she is out on the street, and she's tapped on the shoulder by a young soldier, and they vanish into the dark alley. And then it happens again and again and again. And of course, this is prostitution. And he writes about he calls them Western harlots, and he talks about how they shouldn't be doing this. It is a humiliation to their chastity and to their idea of womanhood and all these things. But he goes on to also say, and this is really interesting, that he is angry not at prostitution itself, but the fact that the people tapping on the shoulder were the Western soldiers. And this, he says, he admits he doesn't know why it makes him so angry, but he feels personally humiliated by this.
Yes, exactly. And that's when I read this memoir of his. It is written. It has been published during the Korean War, but it's kind of like his memoir of what happened 2 years earlier and how he fled to the south, to the south of the southern peninsula, so to Busan. And then this passage indeed came up, and I was very interested to see all these different ideas of the Minjok again. So again, like the reason why he gets angry is indeed again, and he explains, okay, I understand why a man wants to do this, but that a Korean woman is then like helping this along and not being true to her nature, like that is what he's hinting at. That is completely shocking, and that really angers me. And that plays into a lot of these male writers' minds, where they indeed have this very strict idea of like this pure bloodline Minjok idea, that these women are just defiling at that point, and they are not thinking at all about what kind of image this portrays to the rest of the world.
So what was the positive vision that came out throughout this period? How were women idealized throughout this wartime period from both sides?
So Kim Kwang-ju, at the end, he says, well, these women, they should pick up a gun and run to the front and become a Korean Jeanne d'Arc. But yeah, that was not possible, of course, right? It's a patriarchal society. The people fighting at the front were men in South Korea. So becoming a Jeanne d'Arc was, in the minds of these writers, they could become a nurse. So you could join a hospital and then care for the wounded South Korean soldiers. And in this way, you would be virtuous, you would be helping out the nation and showing your loyalty to South Korea. However, again, this is very, like in my mind, part of the patriarchal system. I mean, they have to care for the disabled soldiers, male soldiers' bodies, and that is their task. So it is still a very traditional way of depicting Korean women, and it doesn't really modernize them in any way.
So from this huge patchwork we've been building here, this concept of ideology and writers throughout this period, I might finish on a couple of final questions. And the one that I've really been pinging through my head as I've been listening here is a lot of the things that I've been reading throughout your dissertation here was things that seem to be continuing until the present day. So I wonder what you think, how much of the writing of this period and the ideology that was developed, how much of it do you think survived post-war and perhaps still survives today on both sides of the 38th parallel?
Well, keeping with the women chapter, for example, you can really see that this idea of women and prostitution, and especially prostitution towards foreign soldiers, that one really has remained to this very day. And like these women, they really struggle to be accepted for like their social position in society, and getting a more getting more support from the Korean population. So that is certainly one thing that completely survives to this very day. Another thing is, of course, these depictions of each other. Right? It's very difficult to, even after 1987, 1989, and kind of like the opening up of South Korean society, and this idea that, well, maybe this anti-communist ideology is not all that we are made up of, and we should maybe approach North Korea in a different way. You still see that it's really hampering the way that South Korea can approach North Korea, and of course vice versa as well. North Korea still doesn't take the South very seriously and only wants to deal with the big power America most of the time, and that's also a legacy, I would say, of how they depicted each other and how you can still see this making an appearance today.
And as a final question, I might touch on, I think, where we began the podcast with this idea of total war. And you write towards the end of your dissertation how, in some ways, what you can see surviving is total war on both sides. And that is from the South Korean side, the National Security Act and this idea of constantly searching for internal enemies. And from the North Korean side, is constant playing of America as, again, inhuman and imperial. And when you look at it that way and through the lens of total war, it seems you can see a strong link and a strong remnant here from that period.
Yes, exactly. So what is really obvious when you look at North and South Korean societies is still this idea of the people that constantly need to be mobilized and prepare for a pending war that may break out at any moment. So, of course, especially in North Korea, this is the trope that is, of course, still often used, like this idea that the foreign invaders can still be on our doorstep any moment. So we have to be prepared for this. And the whole society and the institutions that have been set up are all geared towards keeping the people mobilized. They don't have a moment of respite in this. And for South Korea, this is, of course, also still institutionally, it is still there. So you mentioned indeed the national security law that is still not that is still in place. But also this idea of like keeping aware of threats and keeping combat ready. So keeping the young South Korean men in the army for multiple years. That is something that is certainly a legacy of this idea of total war.
Well, that's a good place to leave the podcast on. It's been absolutely fascinating. The dissertation of Jerome's that I used as research for the podcast is called Writing Under Wartime Conditions, North and South Korean Writers During the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, which I'm going to link below. But I'm also going to link below a number of articles that Jerome has written on similar topics. They're broader in some ways and they focus in on smaller areas. And it's all really, really fascinating stuff, not just about Korean literature, but of course, Korean literature during this war period. And I can't recommend the articles or the dissertation enough. On that, Jerome de Wit, thanks for coming on the Korean Hour podcast.
Yes, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Hour podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.